Hello, everybody. So, an exciting instalment of Boring Lecturer Man with his dry ass PowerPoint presentation. Some people seem to like this manner of presenting things. If you're looking for a playing video or anything terribly practically oriented, you might find this a bit boring. So, I just want to warn you up front before I get any rude comments. There's going to be a lot of me talking. But this is in response to what I thought was a perfectly good question, which is, what is functional harmony? And I've been talking about functional harmony and functional tunes for some time. I think it's kind of a shorthand that jazz musicians use, basically to refer to the changes that you might find in, for instance, jazz standards of the Great American Songbook. So not necessarily things written by Wayne Shorter, for example, but things written by Tim Pan-Alley songwriters such as Irving Berlin, Cole Porter, Jerome Kern, and so forth, right? Having addressed that, if you just switch the video off now, you'll have had the basic crux of what I'm talking about. There's basically two ways of looking at what I think of as functional harmony, and one is the classical way and one is the jazz way. And I'm going to go into a little bit of depth into why they differ and how. The why is quite interesting. Basically, one is very formal and taught as a form of aesthetic analysis. So you might look at a piece by Mozart or whatever, and try and use theory to work out how it works. That might just be for the intellectual enjoyment of that, or interest in trying to understand music aesthetically, or it might be because you want to try and take some principles from Mozart and apply them to your own music. In jazz, it's all based around doing stuff, really, either writing or improvising music, and reharmonizing and so on and so forth. Okay, so classical functional harmony, it's generally concerns what's known as common practice music, which is music of the 18th and possibly early 19th century, but anything up to probably about Wagner is considered common practice. Bach, Mozart, Haydn, Vivaldi, that sort of stuff, basically. And it's about, as I said, analysing existing works to understand an aesthetic, or a little bit about how they work, understanding composing new works. So, and it works hand in hand with form. So that's a fundamental difference. In classical music, harmony isn't generally considered, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't really considered to be entirely a thing of its own, just divorced from everything else. And there's no such thing as a good chord progression, as we might sort of think in perhaps the rock, pop, and jazz world. A chord progression serves the form, and the form is related to the melody, so everything kind of unites together. So if you're writing extended works, the way the harmony functions in, say, a sonata or something like that is very different to the way we think about it in terms of writing songs or jazz tunes. However, it can end up being super academic, not necessarily interested in practical applications. So here's the thing, there is jazz scholarship which does this. I've read a few PhD, or at least skimmed a few PhD theses which kind of have this sort of slant. So sort of analysing, why does Wayne Shorter's music work, and then coming up with all kind of complicated explanations involving trapezoids or whatever. And that, to me, is not something that would necessarily end up getting used by a jazz improviser, and it's certainly not, I think, anything that Wayne Shorter was thinking about when he wrote those pieces. It is instead an attempt to understand analytically the aesthetics of that music. Okay? And here's the interesting thing for me. Functional harmony as a concept post-dates much of the music it's interested in analysing. So Mozart, Bach, and so on didn't really have a concept of functional harmony. In fact, functional harmony didn't really enter the picture until, I'm going to look this up, but the late 19th century. So the guy who's really associated with inventing functional harmony is Hugo Riemann. And he was born in 1849, and his best-known work were published. His music theory was published in 1898. Music Lexicon was published in 1882. So this is, given Wagner and Strauss and people were busy tearing up the rule book, this is pretty late in the history of Western harmony. It's like they were categorizing and analyzing it as it was being destroyed, effectively. And a few years later, you'd get Schoenberg. And of course, Schoenberg also wrote a very important text on harmony as well, called Harmony Lehre, or Theory of Harmony, which is not dissimilar to Hugo Riemann's work. So that's sort of functional harmony. I mean, you can trace it back to Rameau in the 18th century. I think it's around 1750 he published his work. And he was the first guy to come up with the idea that chords could be inverted, that all chords weren't just different. So, before then, the chord with the sixth and a third in was just considered a 6-3 chord and wasn't considered to be a first inversion of a triad, for instance. So Riemann came up with this idea, Rameau came up with this idea of kind of theoretical root movement, which to us is now so obvious, it doesn't seem like a thing. But Bach, Mozart, even some of the later composers of that era didn't really use that so much as a compositional technique. It was kind of more used as a theory of analysis. So the point I'm driving at is that analysis in music theory for classical music isn't necessarily about trying to model the processes of the musicians as they came up with the music, because it couldn't possibly, because a lot of this analysis, you can also look at Schenker, for instance, a lot of this analysis kind of post-dates the music that they're looking at. So what they're actually interested in doing is saying, why is this good? What can we learn from this that isn't so obvious, And it seems, from the work of people such as Robert O. Gjerdingen, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, and so on, although this is not uncontested, but it seems that the approach to music before the 19th century was much more based around practical concerns. You're learning a trade, you're learning a craft, and the acquisition of music was much perhaps like learning a language or something. Okay, I want to whiz on. So jazz functional harmony is, generally we don't give a stuff about form because the form is already provided. Usually AABA, of course, in the terms of the Great American Songbook, or ABAC and so on, or 12-bar blues. But generally we're interested in playing over a form or composing over a form, by and large, more than actually composing a fresh form, although that does happen. But when those fresh forms are composed, in general, they tend to be shorter than, say, a sonata, although there are some exceptions. So the tunes are inherited from 20th century songwriting, musical theatre numbers, and so on. Obviously, that's a standards repertoire. Not all jazz musicians play standards, and certainly not all jazz musicians base their music on standards, even beyond those tunes, such as, but often new tunes are written with cannibalized elements, rhythm changes being an obvious example, being the chord changes to I Got Rhythm. Our understanding is more about what we play on existing changes as improvisers. So, you play on I Got Rhythm, you play over a blues, you find ways to embellish and develop what's there in the original song, be it the melody or the chords. So from that point of view, jazz is a music of layers. It's like stacking up layers of detail and complexity on top of each other, which is where this whole sort of idea of extended chords really comes from. It's like, if I play a G minor chord on a E flat major, I'm going to get E flat major 7th, right? And so on. So it's not sort of like a vertical thing in the same way that classical harmony is. It's about taking something and just like kind of overwriting it with new stuff. Okay. Here's for me, the most interesting point. You don't need to play functionally on functional changes. And this has always been true. In fact, if you listen to Lester Young, he was playing modally, so primarily using like G major and G blues tonalities on pop tunes back in the 30s. So, for instance, his famous solo on Lady Be Good, as I always say, in the second bar of his solo, he plays a B on what is written to be a C7 chord. Okay, so he's thinking of the overall tonality. He's not thinking about covering each change. And there's a famous Lester Young quote where he says, "Never tell me the changes," because he didn't want to know what they were. For him, I think he felt that thinking too much about the harmony of the song would inhibit his melodic creativity. And that's an interesting perspective because it's certainly not one that you hear very often these days. Okay, so what do we need to know as jazz musicians, right? We need to learn lots and lots of timpanelli standards and look for patterns to understand functional harmony. That's not every jazz musician in the world has to do this, right? Some people, Scott Henderson springs to mind, don't know many like old school standards, but the music that he writes and plays is not fundamentally based on functional harmony. So if we want to understand functional harmony as jazz musicians, perhaps the best way is just to learn lots of songs and look for patterns. And then having done that, you can do this in non-functional tunes as well. I mean, if you want to learn a bunch of Wayne Shorter tunes, you're probably going to find patterns, right? For instance, he does like the 1 to flat 2 thing quite a lot. Okay? So that's not necessarily about Tin Pan Alley standards, but the thing about Tin Pan Alley standards is everybody had a shared common practice style of harmony, whereas if you go later into the history of jazz, you're going to find individual jazz composers have their own distinct way, perhaps, of looking at harmony. Like the way Kurt Rosenwinkel writes changes might not be the same as the way Kenny Wheeler writes changes, for instance. Okay, so we learn related patterns or substitutes. So we learn things that can kind of basically be put in over the top of something else or swapped out for something else, or basically has the same basic function within the tune. And we learn to describe these patterns in our playing. So what we call descriptive language, for instance, going up and down arpeggios to give a sense of harmony. If that's one of the basic sort of skills we expect people to learn as jazz musicians, is to be able to play harmony in their lines, so it's freestanding. So it's not just like it doesn't need a backing track or other musicians to make it sound good. It has its it already expresses the harmony in the music. We learn ways of applying what we know, voicings, lines, etc. to these patterns. So that's not exactly the same thing, because often lines will have elements of descriptive harmony in them, descriptive language, sorry, and sometimes they'll also have like blues or more kind of scalar elements. So it's a real mix. A line might express some kind of harmony, but actually might be flexible enough to allow you to apply it in different harmonic contexts. So I've done a few examples of that on my channel. For instance, a line which works over a major 2-5-1 or a minor 2-5-1 might work over the relative major or minor, right? So if you've got a line that works in D minor, E minor 7 flat 5, A7 flat 9, D minor, for instance, that's the original context that you saw it in. It would actually also very often work over an F, 2-5-1, so like G minor, C7F. Okay. Start collecting, that's the first one. So I've just done a whole load of different changes here, which you can see I've said where I've got the tune, which tune, I've got it from. Then I've talked about the progression in terms of its original context, the original key, and then I've turned it into Roman numerals. So Roman numerals is basically the most important analytical tool you've got as a musician, and this is used in various ways. There's the traditional functional Roman numeral system used in classical music. We're not using that here. There's a Nashville system, which this is closer to. Generally, I'm just sort of notating everything like a chord symbol, so I'm giving the Roman numeral capital letters, and then just doing the chord color afterwards. If it doesn't have a chord color specified, it's major, right? Just like chord symbols. Okay, so you can see there's a few different ones there. And then, looking for repeated patterns. So if you look, you can see that these are all very similar things. They all go from 1 and wend their way into 6 minor or relative minor via some form of 2-5 or 5 in this case, or even a slightly longer progression. This is 1-4-7 and then a 2-5-1 into C minor, okay? Or 7-3-6 if you prefer. You see that's a back cycling chord progression. I could have also included Autumn Leaves as well, which has it's similar. But you can see like there's a whole bunch of different ways to do that same thing, and depending on the amount of time you've got in the music, you might use more or less chords, but they do the same thing. That's the important thing to notice. And then the next step that I like is reduction or simplification. So just to explain this a little bit, I've talked about this in other videos. So rather than just going from like, it's just having the basic chord symbols, you can see that there are some chords that I essentially just view as being moving chords. So a good example is, if you have a look, you can see I replaced that sharp 4 diminished with just an arrow going 4 back to 1, because that's its function. That's what it does. It just bridges those two chords together. The same thing I do with that little E minor 7 flat 5, A7 flat 9 to D minor thing. I just say that's an arrow into 6 minor, which is basically what I said in the last page. when it gets to these sort of as honeysuckle rose goes from 1 to 4 and then to 5 7, so 2 7 there, the G7 kind of functions as a way of what we might call tonicizing or setting up as a real movement into 5 7. So 2 7 is like the dominant to use classical functional harmony language. Okay, and then it gets a little bit tricky, as you can see with the next one. This is the middle 8 of rhythm changes. For this, I've just decided to keep the chords as they are, because in jazz, very often you will see improvisers tending to use each chord as a separate tonality in tunes like Rhythm Changes and Sweet Georgia Brown and so on. They won't necessarily see them so much as passing chords, so that's why I've done that. The next one, sharp 4 minor 7, this little long turnaround from night and day, which is very interesting. I've basically seen as a way of getting from sharp 4 minor 7 flat 5, which isn't a diatonic chord, of course, to 3 minor to 2 minor, and then presumably back to 1. I haven't put the 1 in there. Okay, so it's kind of basically just going down the scale with bridging chords, which are minor 7th and diminished. Okay, so the next thing, which is quite useful, is functional harmony. This is Hugo Riemann's idea. I talked about Hugo Riemann a little bit earlier. And his basic idea, which I think is still quite current in jazz, is the idea that you divide the sort of diatonic scale and the chords of the diatonic scale, built from each root, into 3 basic regions. So it's tonic, subdominant, dominant, and tonic. And if you notice, you can see those arrows, you follow it around. So you go from tonic, subdominant, dominant, tonic. And that's basically how a 2-5 works. So you go subdominant 2, dominant 5, tonic 1, right? Okay. So there's a few interesting things about this. The first thing is that actually, as it turns out, music didn't necessarily follow this structure until people start thinking about it this way. I think it's the same with chord scale theory. The theory sometimes comes first and then the music changes slightly because people are taught that way. That's an interesting effect which I might explore elsewhere. Also, you can turnarounds work the same way, right? Tonic, subdominant, dominant. Yeah, so that seems to work well enough for something like rhythm changes, even. Of course, that sharp 4 diminished or 4 minor doesn't really fit into the dominant role so clearly. So actually, it's a little bit hazy, which leads me to this kind of jazz version, and this represents what I've heard from people like Peter Bernstein. People talk about George Benson's concept for playing changes, which is similar. And also, it kind of reflects to some extent what Barry Harris would talk about in terms of a simple 2-5-1, for instance. So the other thing, by the way, is that, let's talk about these chords. So each of these, 3 chord trick chords, 1, 4, 5, which are familiar to most guitarists, have a relative minor that's a minor third down. And this relative minor is considered to have the same function. However, in jazz, the 3 minor is not often used as a dominant substitute. 3 major or 3-7, sure, but not 3 minor. In fact, 3 minor has much more of a tonic function. We tend to associate it with being a 1 chord. So, for instance, we might play a 3-6-2-5 instead of a 1-6-2-5. Okay, so because of that, you see that I've changed the grouping of the chords slightly. And I see the subdominant and dominant now as overlapping, having some commonality. And so it's more of a binary system, if you like. And you can play the subdominant sound over the dominant. Lester Young, again, does this a lot. Wes Montgomery. I've demonstrated it on the videos. So the subdominant kind of does have its own thing, especially if you go to chord 4. It doesn't sound great to play 5 over it. But it has its own identity, but it overlaps with the dominant as well. So subdominant sounds good on dominant, and sometimes it sounds fine to substitute subdominant with the dominant. It just really depends. So it's not like an absolute distinction, which of course theorists hate, but practically this is what jazz musicians seem to end up doing. It's a much simpler way of looking at things. So because of that, we think of that as maybe the TD system, tonic dominant, or I always think of a tonic subdominant. Subdominant always sounds great over everything, but tonic dominant is the one that seems most mainstream, that I've heard the most from people. Okay, so moving on, functional analysis then becomes a matter of just like blocking things down to one of these 2 functions. So the 4 sharp 4 diminished 1 obviously just becomes 4-1, which is, in this case, dominant or subdominant tonic. And in this case, I think like it kind of makes more sense to think about it as a subdominant. As I said, it sounds better. On the other hand, there's this progression here from blues for Alice, the 1, 7, 3, 6, is really more of a just going from tonic major to tonic minor, relative minor. We can see this 1, 7, 4, 6, 2, 5 thing. This is the Bridge of Honeysuckle Rose. So we're really going to the subdominant area and then going to the dominant, very much so. And then see how I've again left that 3, 6, 2, 5 alone, because I kind of feel like in jazz each of those chords becomes its own sort of region. I feel like you can't simplify that down in that way. Which is why tunes like Lulu's Back in Town are so hard to play, because each dominant, in the end you just played blues over it, right? In numerals, you can see that I've kind of, for this progression now, the night and day cold water turnaround, I've just simplified that down as 2 types of tonic going to a dominant, because that sharp 4 minor 7 flat 5 is most often used as a substitute for 1. And you can see that in tunes like I Thought About You, for instance. Okay, that's one is simply a 2-5-1, which we're going to think of as a dominant tonic, which is the way Barry Harris would think of it, the dominant scale going to the 1 scale. Okay, this is chromatic chords. You've got secondary dominants, so you've got to look out for these. These all are very common in standards repertoire. Secondary dominants, they generally move up a fourth or down a semitone. Borrowed minor. These are chords that are borrowed from a parallel minor key. So if you're in the key of C major, chords from C minor. Passing chords, which are generally diminished chords, they sort of bridge chords together. We've seen a few in examples of our, of our changes. Neapolitan chords, fruity subdominant type things. Flat 2 is the most obvious one. It's kind of, you can see it as a substitution of the parallel Phrygian or even Locrian modes. And augmented sixths, which are kind of not well understood by jazz musicians, but I thought I'd bring them up because they often don't resolve like tritone subs. So flat 6 often can go straight to 1 as well as to 5-7. The 6-7 is flat 6-7 is not a substitution for another chord. It's a chord in its own right. So, for instance, if you look at 18th century harmonizations in the minor scale, you're going to find a flat 6-7 chord as we conceptualize of it today, going down the scale. Mozart uses that sound all of the time. In the last page, I've got, what isn't functional harmony, which is actually quite a hard question to answer because it's not always clear cut. So bop and side slip harmony, for instance, tunes like Moments Notice, Stablemates, that kind of thing, that actually has very clear functionality. Usually you can track those side slips down to some sort of substitution of other chord progressions that are simpler. They definitely have a direction and a sense of tonality to them. You've got questions of things like, is giant steps functional? Is 26-2 functional? And it is, in the sense that it has lots of 2-5-1s in and they act in a fairly obvious way, but it's obviously modulates far more than your average Great American Songbook tune. So that's quite interesting in itself. Vamps and modes are not functional, but they can actually have functionality superimposed on them. For instance, the example of Cannonball Adderley, who played changes that weren't there over the top of So What or whatever. Jobim is functional, but weird. Okay, so you'll often see chord progressions are a little bit non-standard in Jobim, but normally they have quite a strong functionality to them. They feel like they move to target chords or whatever, even if they do so in an unusual way. Wayne Shorter is functional at least sometimes. A good example of a tune which kind of goes between vamps and more functional approaches would be something like Yes and No, which has a sort of vamp on D sus going to a vamp on D major, and then some quick 2-5-1s, which are obviously more functional. Then the bridge has a very sort of standard form, somewhat like Night in Tunisia, for instance, or whatever. Other tunes, like sometimes you look at progressions of his and think, oh, that sounds functional, but it doesn't look like any progression that I've ever seen in a Great American Songbook standard. So, for instance, the progression, can I remember that one all right? It goes, there's progression from Speak No Evil which is quite strange. Kind of goes E minor, C minor, D minor, B flat minor, and that feels functional. And actually, it can be shown to be a substitution of a more functional progression, but it obviously isn't functional in an obvious way from the point of view of 251s. Same with Kenny Wheeler. Kurt's harmony certainly references functionality, but again, it kind of is a step out. What about Alan Holdsworth's music? I don't really know. I think Alan Holdsworth kind of was more interested in colours and modal sounds, so I don't know if his music is functional. But hopefully you get from that the realisation that it's much easier to talk about what functionality definitely is, and everybody can agree something like Autumn Leaves is functional, for instance, and it's actually much harder to agree what isn't functional. Anyway, thanks for watching. I hope you find it interesting. Bye.